My favorite science story this week is about how important local news is. And specifically, it's about how local news, as opposed to online news outlets, help to reduce crime, saving the community millions of dollars. And before I get into this, I should give some disclosure. I do work with local news outlets on radio and TV across Canada, so I have this financial stake in the success of local news. So I am predisposed to like what the study found, but I didn't do the study, I'm just reporting on it. It was done by two researchers at George Mason University. I'll put a link to the paper in the comments, and it is behind a paywall, so if you're having trouble getting a hold of it, just hit me up and I'll set you up with the paper. This scientific study makes a really strong argument that local news prevents corruption by threatening the would-be perpetrators with the threat of a public shaming that is a special kind of public shaming that really only comes from being on the 6 o'clock news or having your face on the cover of the local newspaper, and that kind of public shaming just isn't possible when you're on a blog or something like that. The argument is that local news has the ability to set the agenda. They sort of pick the conversation that's going on in the city, and if that's somebody's alleged crimes, that can be embarrassing for the people who have committed those crimes. And so this deters people from committing crimes. And the way they get at this with the experiment is to look at the natural experiment that's going on across the United States right now, where newspapers are closing up, and to see whether all these criminals that were suppressed while the newspaper was active all of a sudden come out of the woodwork and commit more crimes after the newspapers go away. And the way they get at that is to look at how many corruption cases there are in federal courts. So the data set includes 70 local papers that went out of business over 23 years, starting in the 90s. And in each case, researchers looked at three different things. They looked at the number of corruption charges in federal courts for that district. They looked at the number of defendants in those cases, and they looked at the number of cases overall. So a case can have multiple charges, it can have multiple defendants. So really you've got three metrics of the same thing, which is how much work do public prosecutors have in federal courts dealing with corruption cases. And these are things like embezzlement, bribery, fraud, stuff like that. And using any of those three metrics, they all found the same thing, that basically the amount of crime went up by about 7% when the newspapers shut down. And the researchers point out these are federal cases, and about 90% of federal cases end up being guilty. And so this is a pretty good index of an increase in criminal activity, not necessarily just overzealousness by public prosecutors. So I think that's interesting. The newspapers are reducing the amount of crime when they're in business, and then when the newspaper goes away, the crime sort of flourishes. And the paper ends with this financial argument about why communities might want to invest in local newspapers. And they point out this example of the Northern District of Illinois, which I believe is where Chicago is. And there, corruption cases from the 70s to 2012 cost an average of about $500 million every year, just for that region. So if you're reducing that by 7%, you're saving that community around $40 million every year in taxes. So having local news in your community is saving money, and it's reducing corruption, and by extension, it's probably reducing other kinds of crime as well. It's pretty cool. It really shows that local news makes a difference. And I don't know, it tells you why Peter Parker and Clark Kent work at newspapers. They're committed to fighting crime, and they were doing it with their day job as well. Every week I round up my 5 favorite science stories. This is just one of the 5. The only way to find out about the other 4 is to sign up for my email newsletter. It's called The Bat Signal. It's free, it comes out once a week. And this week I've got ants wearing eye patches, and I have a scientific analysis of Rolling Stone album reviews. Sign up. It's at followthebatsignal.com.